January 25, 1944. 0617 hours. 2 kilometers northwest of Cisterna di Latina, Italy. The morning light had not yet broken through the thick, colorless fog that drifted across the sodden fields and ruined farmhouses scattered along the approaches to the town. The terrain sat low and uneven, scarred by weeks of shelling. Mortar pits flooded overnight. Tree lines hid machine gun teams. Every rise in the ground held the risk of a German observer ready to call in counter-battery fire within seconds of an Allied mortar launch. The Anzio campaign had entered a violent stage. Long-range duels between entrenched German artillery and advancing Allied infantry intensified every hour, and casualty rates climbed as mortar crews struggled to survive the first minutes of each firing mission. Corporal Einar Thorsen stood over the shallow emplacement his team had dug the previous night. Cold mud clung to his boots and the sleeves of his field jacket. He scanned the open field ahead. The 81mm mortar sat ready. Ammunition crates lined the trench wall. A standard mortar mission demanded the team fire fast, adjust quickly, and then brace for the inevitable German response. The counter-battery fire usually arrived within 90 seconds. Sometimes sooner. The newly arrived replacements had already witnessed how unforgiving the battlefield was for crews without cover. 2 mortar teams had been hit earlier in the week while still setting up their tubes. 6 men died in under 3 minutes because they had no protection. The survivors understood the same truth. Digging in required time they did not have. Einar studied the ground again. He had been a tenant farmer in rural Minnesota before the war. For most of his life he worked long days moving grain, reinforcing storage areas, and building temporary windbreaks from materials on hand. He handled canvas sacks filled with wheat and soil. He understood how weight settled, how layers absorbed impact, and how fast a barrier could be assembled if the process was simple. In the last 48 hours he had watched mortar crews attempt to dig defensive positions under fire. Each attempt ended in chaos. The earth was too wet. The soil collapsed into the shovel cuts. The shelling never stopped long enough for a complete emplacement. Mortar crews who tried to dig still died. Mortar crews who did not dig also died. The problem sat in plain sight. They needed protection in under 2 minutes, not 15. The previous night, during a lull in the fighting, Einar walked the perimeter while others tried to rest. He saw empty grain bags near a wrecked barn. The bags matched the canvas sacks he used on the farm. Thick weave. Durable. Designed to hold weight without tearing. He lifted one and turned it over in his hands. The idea formed quickly. The front-line soil was loose enough to scoop rapidly. A standard bag could be filled in seconds. Packed earth inside canvas could absorb fragmentation and deflect low-angle shrapnel. Layered bags could make a quick, dense wall. It would not stop direct hits. It did not need to. Mortar crews died from shrapnel and grazing rounds while loading tubes. A half-meter of layered filled sacks could reduce lethal fragments and provide a crucial few seconds of survival. When dawn approached, Einar spoke with his team. He explained how farmers built temporary barriers. He described the way grain bags settled under pressure. The crew listened without protest. They trusted him. He had guided them through several engagements with steady judgment. They gathered every usable grain bag from the farm ruins along the perimeter. They carried them back to the mortar pit. The fog thickened as they worked. The artillery duel on the far flank continued. Distant thunder rolled through the valley. Allied infantry prepared for another push toward Cisterna. German lines shifted in response. At 0605 hours, runners delivered coordinates for a fire mission. German infantry had begun probing the Allied right flank. Enemy positions were concealed in orchards near the town's northern wall. The battalion needed immediate indirect fire support to disrupt the advance. Einar's team set to work. They filled grain bags with soil in seconds. They stacked them in a staggered pattern around the front of the mortar pit. The barrier reached knee height within a minute. The second layer added stability. The third layer completed the shield. Einar tamped the top bags with his boots to settle the mass. The structure held firm. The barrier could be extended or removed in moments. The crew prepared the mortar. The first round dropped at 0617 hours. The tube barked. The recoil vibrated through the ground. Seconds later, the round landed on target. A runner shouted for rapid adjustment. The second round left the tube. The third followed. The tension in the air thickened. Einar's crew counted silently. They knew the pattern. German counter-battery teams would track the launch flash and respond. Counter-fire often arrived before the fifth round. The mortar crews in the sector had been losing men to shrapnel bursts that tore through shallow earthworks. The grain bag shield stood firm. The soil inside the bags settled under the tremor of each mortar blast. At 0620 hours, the first German counter-battery round hit 100 meters to the west. Dirt and debris sprayed across the field. The crew braced. Another round detonated 80 meters away. Einar crouched behind the shield. The explosion sent fragments whining across the air. He heard sharp impacts on the canvas barrier. None of the crew were hit. The eyes of the youngest team member widened. He pressed closer behind the makeshift wall. The barrage intensified. A third shell struck 60 meters out. The blast wave rolled across the pit. The shield absorbed the fragments. Loose soil spilled over the top. No one moved from position. The steady rhythm of indirect fire continued. The grain bag shield performed as Einar expected. Each layer absorbed more energy. The barrier remained intact. The crew maintained the mission. They fired round after round. The orchard ahead lit with bursts. The German probe stalled. The barrage shifted. Enemy machine gun teams attempted to flank the mortar position. Rounds snapped across the field, striking the barrier with fast, violent impacts. The dense canvas and packed soil stopped most fragments. Some rounds embedded into the top layer. The crew stayed low. The assistant gunner continued feeding rounds into the tube. Einar directed adjustments with calm precision. The 2-minute window that normally killed mortar teams passed with no casualties. Einar looked at his men. Their faces were coated with dust. Their breath came in hard bursts. None were bleeding. The shield gave them the one thing doctrine never could. Immediate protection. Quick to build. Quick to move. Built from materials no one expected to matter. Einar watched the field beyond the shield as the counter-battery fire tapered off. The fog began to thin, revealing the shattered shapes of olive trees and the distant movement of German infantry attempting to reposition. His crew stayed crouched, ready to fire again at any moment. The grain bag barrier showed clear signs of impact. Small tears marked the outer canvas. Soil leaked from a few seams. The top layer sagged from repeated shock. Yet the barrier held firm. Every man behind it understood what it meant. For the first time in days they had fired a complete early morning mission without suffering casualties during the opening minutes. It felt unreal. Mortar crews across the sector had been fighting under the shadow of near-guaranteed loss. Today that changed. A sergeant from a nearby rifle unit approached the pit. He had seen the shield while moving along the line. His face showed disbelief. He knelt, touched the layered bags and traced the torn canvas where fragments had embedded. He asked Einar how long it took to build. Einar gave the exact time. Less than 2 minutes for the 3-layer front shield. The sergeant nodded and looked around the field. He understood how rare rapid protection was for mortar teams. He said nothing more, only told Einar to keep firing and moved on. At 0631 hours new coordinates arrived. German infantry still attempted to push toward the Allied flank. The battalion commander needed continuous indirect fire to break the momentum of the assault. The mortar tube barked again. The shield absorbed more impacts. No one flinched. The crew worked with steady precision. Einar managed adjustments with practiced discipline. The fire mission continued for 8 minutes. By the time the order to pause arrived at 0639 hours, more than 24 rounds had been fired. The German advance slowed to a crawl. The crew finally stepped back from the tube. Steam drifted from the mortar barrel. Their shoulders ached from tension. Mud coated their uniforms. Yet the realization settled in. They were alive. The shield had taken several direct fragment strikes. Without it, one man said they would already be dead. The youngest member of the crew ran his hand along the top row of bags. He found a twisted steel fragment buried deep in the canvas. He pulled it free and held it up. It was an inch long. Enough to tear through flesh. Enough to end a career or a life. Einar picked up one of the torn bags and examined the damage. He noted where the soil compacted under repeated impact. He saw how the lower layers stabilized the upper ones. The structure remained sound. He realized something else. If the shield could be built larger without slowing deployment, they could create an arc of protection around the pit. That would counter flanking fire. The idea formed quickly. The team already collected extra bags. The soil remained easy to scoop. The fog covered movement. They had the opportunity to improve the barrier before the next mission. The team got to work immediately. They extended the shield to both sides of the pit. They filled more bags. They layered them following the same pattern. Staggered joints. Tight seams. 3 rows high. The process went faster than expected. Their hands moved with new confidence. Within 4 minutes they built a half-circle barrier around the mortar pit. It was not perfect. It did not need to be. It provided coverage where none existed before. A lieutenant arrived as they finished the extension. He observed the structure in silence. He examined the scars left by fragments. He asked Einar to explain the concept. Einar described the way farmers built temporary grain walls. He explained how layered weight distributed force. He stated the simple requirement. Mortar crews needed fast protection during the first minutes of every firing mission. The lieutenant listened with growing interest. He realized the tactical value. He told Einar he would report the idea to battalion headquarters. He also ordered the crew to maintain readiness. More fire missions were expected. The sound of machine guns echoed from the direction of Cisterna. The German counterattack gained strength. Radio traffic increased across the line. Mortar teams prepared for another wave of missions. Some crews noticed the grain bag shield around Einar's pit. They walked past and studied it. They asked questions. They picked up torn canvas and examined the fragment holes. They looked at the layered construction. Soon other crews began gathering grain bags from the surrounding ruins. They started filling them with soil. They repeated the pattern Einar designed. They built their own rapid shields. At 0704 hours the next fire mission order came. Enemy infantry were massing behind a stone wall near the northern orchard. Artillery alone could not clear them. Mortars had to strike fast before the Germans moved again. Einar gave the command. The mortar tube fired repeated bursts. The shield absorbed more impacts. The crew remained focused. They passed ammunition with speed. They tracked adjustments. The German counter-battery response returned with force. Shells landed within 50 meters. Fragment bursts hit the shield. Soil spilled across the pit. The crew stayed protected. During the barrage, one shell landed close enough to shake the entire position. The explosion sent a wave of heat and dust over the crew. Debris rained down. The grain bag wall flexed but did not collapse. Several fragments struck the bags at lethal velocity. They failed to penetrate fully. The team did not break formation. They continued firing. The fire mission succeeded. The German infantry scattered behind the orchard wall. Allied rifle units advanced several meters. The flank stabilized. When the barrage ended, the battlefield fell into a tense silence. Smoke drifted across the field. Distant gunfire continued. The crew breathed hard but stayed alert. They studied the damage to the shield. The front row of bags showed deep gouges. The middle row was intact. The third row held firm. The structure still worked. Einar realized the concept could be improved even more. If crews pre-filled a set of bags before deploying to a position, they could create even stronger barriers in under 1 minute. More soldiers gathered around the pit. Word had spread across the line. Officers and enlisted men inspected the barrier. They asked how many bags were used. They asked about the layering. They asked about weight and stability. Some took notes. Others helped reposition torn bags. Mortar crews across the sector saw the results. They saw living proof of rapid field innovation that saved lives. Einar leaned on the mortar tube for a moment. He felt the strain in his arms and back. He looked at his men. They were tired but still operational. Their survival validated the idea he formed from years of farming. Simple materials. Fast assembly. Practical structure. It was enough to shift the balance of a lethal problem. The morning fog lifted further as the sun began to push through the low clouds. Visibility improved across the shattered farmland. With the increased light came increased danger. German forward observers relied on clear skies to direct counter-battery fire with accuracy. Mortar positions that survived dawn barrages often faced deadlier strikes once the day brightened. Einar understood this. His crew understood it. The grain bag shield delayed death. It did not eliminate the threat. They needed to stay ready for rapid relocation if the Germans adjusted their aim. At 0728 hours a runner delivered word that enemy spotters had shifted to higher ground near a broken vineyard wall east of the line. The battalion expected heavier counter-fire soon. Mortar crews prepared to move positions if the pressure increased. But the same challenge remained. Whenever crews relocated they needed time to dig in. Time was the one thing no one had. Einar examined the expanded grain bag shield and considered another possibility. If they built modular segments in advance they could carry or drag sections of the barrier to new positions. The soil-filled bags weighed less than standard sandbags because of the loose Italian topsoil. 4 men could lift a cluster of 3 bags at once. If each crew built modular elements during lulls, they could deploy protection at any new site in under 2 minutes. He told this idea to his team. They studied the shield with careful eyes. The concept made sense. They began assembling 3 bag modules tied with spare rope. They created 4 modules in minutes. Each module could be carried by 2 men. They stacked the modules near the mortar pit. Other crews took notice. 2 units copied the method immediately. At 0735 hours German mortar fire returned. Rounds landed across the sector at unpredictable intervals. One round detonated near a supply route, sending debris into the air. Another struck the edge of a rifle platoon's shallow trench. Casualties mounted again. The line held but with growing strain. Mortar teams were ordered to suppress the enemy mortar positions with counter-fire of their own. Einar's team prepared another fire mission. They pulled the modules closer to the pit. They reinforced the left side of the grain bag wall to guard against indirect fire coming from the east. The fog continued to lift. German gunners gained greater clarity with each minute. The danger increased. Yet the shield offered a sense of stability that mortar crews rarely experienced. It provided a small measure of control in a battlefield defined by unpredictability. At 0742 hours the order came. Fire mission targeting German mortar teams across a shallow ridge 900 meters away. Einar adjusted the tube. The assistant gunner placed the first round. The tube barked. The shot arced over the ridge. The team waited for the correction. Seconds later it arrived. Adjust left. 2 degrees. Fire for effect. The team moved with precision. Rounds thudded into the tube. The shield trembled under incoming shrapnel but held firm. The Germans returned fire with greater accuracy. 2 shells hit within 40 meters. The blast threw soil across the pit. The shield absorbed fragments. A fragment hit the top row with force and embedded nearly halfway through. Einar pressed his palm against the canvas. The soil inside had compressed into a dense mass. It resisted penetration. He felt the vibration through the fabric. It reminded him of the pressure tests he performed on grain walls during storms back home. The memory strengthened his confidence in the design. The fire mission intensified. More shells landed. A shell fragment tore through one of the outer bags and scattered soil across the ground. The module remained functional. The crew continued firing without breaking rhythm. They trusted the barrier. They trusted the concept born from farming work thousands of miles away. The German mortar team stopped firing at 0749 hours. Allied infantry reported reduced incoming rounds. The counter-fire succeeded. The battalion commander sent word that the mortar crews were to remain ready for immediate redeployment. The enemy might attempt a flank shift or concentrate artillery elsewhere. Einar evaluated the shield again. The front section needed repair. The upper layer sagged. Soil spilled through torn seams. Yet the core remained intact. The crew replaced the damaged top row. They filled 2 new bags and positioned them with deliberate care. Within 1 minute the barrier regained shape and strength. As they worked, a senior officer from battalion headquarters arrived. He had been briefed on the shield's effectiveness and wanted to see it himself. He examined the structure from several angles. He asked Einar detailed questions about material strength, soil density, bag placement and assembly time. Einar answered each question with precision. The officer's expression shifted from curiosity to respect. He understood the tactical advantage. He also understood the broader implications. If one mortar crew could reduce casualties with simple field materials, the entire battalion could adopt the method. He told Einar that he would recommend formal documentation of the technique. He also ordered additional crews to gather grain bags from abandoned farm buildings. He emphasized urgency. The Germans would not slow their pressure. Crews needed protection now. At 0803 hours sporadic small arms fire erupted to the northeast. Allied infantry reported German attempts to infiltrate gaps in the line. Mortar crews across the sector prepared for rapid missions. Einar's crew stayed behind the shield. They cleared debris. They checked ammunition. They repositioned modules to cover weaknesses. The air felt thick with anticipation. The grain bag shield gave them confidence but not complacency. They knew the battlefield could shift at any moment. They knew the next barrage could be heavier than the last. The sound of heavy machine gun fire echoed across the field. German units attempted another coordinated push. A runner arrived again. Fire mission. Immediate. Coordinates followed. Infantry needed support. Einar's team snapped into action. The mortar tube fired multiple rounds. The shield trembled but stayed firm. Fragments struck the barrier again. Soil spilled down the edges. Dust rose from the ground. The team crouched low. They continued firing. The German response came fast. Shells struck within 30 meters. The explosions shook the earth. The crew gritted their teeth. The shield absorbed shock after shock. Einar crouched behind the left module. He watched a cloud of fragments spray across the field and vanish into the grain bag wall. The protection held. The crew remained unharmed. The fire mission lasted 6 minutes. The German assault stalled again. The mortar pit fell silent. The crew finally exhaled. Their uniforms were coated with dust. Their ears rang from the repeated blasts. They leaned against the shield and observed the damage. Several bags were torn. Soil poured from the seams. But the core of the structure stood strong. It had protected them through another violent exchange. A rifleman approached the pit. He had witnessed the bombardment from a trench 50 meters away. He said the crew should have been wiped out. The shield prevented that. His voice carried a mixture of relief and awe. He asked if his own unit could build a similar structure around their forward observation post. Einar said yes. He explained the technique again. The riflemen left immediately to gather supplies. By mid-morning the battlefield shifted again. The fog had fully lifted and the sun broke through in thin patches between drifting smoke. German artillery crews took advantage of the clarity. Their counter-battery strikes increased in volume and accuracy. Shells landed with tighter spacing. Crews across the sector faced escalating danger. Several reported near misses. One crew east of Einar's position suffered 2 wounded when fragments ricocheted off a stone wall. The pressure intensified for everyone on the line. Einar's crew adjusted the shield once more. They reinforced the front arc with 2 extra modules. They filled additional bags to replace damaged rows. The barrier now formed a near-complete horseshoe shape around the pit, leaving only the rear section open for ammunition access. The structure weighed several hundred kilograms yet remained movable in sections. The men worked with practiced speed. Their hands were numb from cold, but their movements remained precise. Repetition had sharpened their technique. At 0846 hours another officer arrived, this time from division support staff. He had heard multiple reports of an improvised shield that allowed mortar teams to survive situations that usually resulted in high casualties. He wanted to witness it under fire. Einar explained the construction again. The officer listened closely. He took notes about the bag type, soil density, stacking pattern, and time required for assembly. He inspected the torn canvas. He touched the compressed soil. He ran his fingers along the fragment marks. He nodded. He said other units on the line were already attempting similar structures based on word of mouth. He told Einar that if the concept continued to prove effective, command might instruct mortar units to carry a supply of empty grain bags and field kits. He said the simplicity of the idea was its strength. No new equipment. No additional burden on logistics. Only repurposed field materials. Einar silently noted that farmers often relied on the same principle. Use what exists. Change what is necessary. Solve the immediate problem. At 0853 hours fresh German infantry formations were spotted assembling behind a series of old stone terraces near Cisterna's northern approach. The battalion suspected another coordinated push. Allied rifle companies prepared to hold the line. Mortar teams received updated target grids. They checked their tubes, ammunition and bearing settings. Einar's crew stood ready. Their shields stood firm. The barrage began at 0901 hours. Einar's team fired the opening rounds. The blast echoed across the valley. They adjusted quickly. The orchard ahead erupted with smoke and debris as rounds landed near the German staging points. Rifle units confirmed early hits. German forces dispersed, attempting to maneuver behind cover. The crew kept firing. The shield absorbed more impacts. Fragments struck with violent force. Loose soil spilled across the interior. Dust filled the air. The men continued without hesitation. Suddenly, at 0907 hours, a shell landed close enough to shake the entire pit. The explosion blasted soil high into the air and showered the crew with debris. The top layer of the shield sagged. One bag tore open completely. Soil collapsed forward. But the structure did not break. The men behind it stayed alive. The assistant gunner wiped mud from his face and continued loading. Einar steadied the tube and called the next adjustment. They resumed firing before the echo of the blast faded. By 0912 hours the German push faced severe disruption. Allied rifle units reported fewer incoming machine gun bursts. The mortar barrages had broken up several platoon-sized movements. The German assault lost its cohesion. Still, counter-battery fire continued. The enemy refused to surrender ground easily. Rounds landed closer. 2 bursts sent fragments skimming along the shield with metallic shrieks. The crew pressed against the bags for cover. The soil inside shifted under impact but held. At 0915 hours, a radio operator from the rifle company arrived breathless. He relayed an urgent message. German infantry had infiltrated a trench line to the northeast and were attempting to flank the mortar positions. Several mortar crews prepared for emergency relocation. Without protection, moving under fire was almost impossible. But Einar's modules offered a solution. His crew lifted the pre-tied clusters. 2 men carried each module. They positioned them to extend the shield toward the threatened flank. The structure expanded in under 30 seconds. They formed a protective corridor along the left side of the pit. The operator stared in disbelief. The shield offered mobile cover on demand. Machine gun fire erupted from the orchard. Rounds snapped overhead and struck the new extension. The modules absorbed the impact. Soil spilled down the sides. A few fragments penetrated the outer canvas but failed to reach the crew. Einar directed 2 men to maintain the left flank while the others resumed firing. The tube dropped round after round. Smoke and dust filled the valley. By 0923 hours, the German infiltration attempt collapsed under combined rifle and mortar fire. The flanking threat ended. The crew lowered the modules and repositioned them for future use. Several other mortar teams approached, asking about the mobile extension method. Einar explained it again in simple terms. Tie bags in clusters. Carry with 2 men. Place quickly. Reinforce with soil. The crews listened and repeated the instructions. At 0931 hours, division staff sent an order. All mortar crews in the sector were to adopt emergency fortification measures modeled on Einar's shield. Officers moved from position to position, instructing teams to gather grain bags and replicate the construction. The battlefield became a workshop of rapid innovation. Men filled bags with soil. They stacked them. They formed arcs of protection. They tied modules for movement. In less than 20 minutes, several positions transformed from exposed pits to fortified emplacements. Einar watched the transformation with quiet focus. His idea had spread faster than he anticipated. What started as a simple memory from the farm had become a tactical adaptation across an entire sector. The shield gave mortar teams a new chance at survival during the lethal first minutes of every engagement. It allowed them to continue supporting infantry units without immediate fear of being wiped out. It shifted the tempo of the battlefield. At 0942 hours, a brief calm settled over the area. The artillery duel paused. Smoke drifted across the fields. The sound of small arms fire faded. Mortar crews repaired their shields. Rifle units repositioned. Officers reviewed maps. Everyone expected the fighting to resume soon. The Germans had not given up the ground. The Allied push toward Cisterna remained slow and costly. Einar's crew drank water and caught their breath. Their faces showed exhaustion but also determination. They had survived several close barrages. They knew the shield saved them. They also knew they had more work ahead. The day was far from over. The brief calm ended at 0956 hours when German artillery returned with renewed force. The new barrage came from positions farther east, suggesting that enemy spotters had shifted again. The shells landed with deliberate precision. Their spacing indicated coordinated fire rather than sporadic harassment. Mortar crews braced for a sustained attack. Rifle units hunkered down. The valley echoed with rolling blasts. Einar's crew moved behind the shield. They reinforced weak points and cleared soil from the interior walkway. The shield showed accumulated damage from earlier strikes. The top row sagged in places. Several seams had torn. Soil leaked steadily. Yet the structure continued to protect them. They checked ammunition. They checked the tube. They waited. At 1001 hours, the order came. Immediate fire mission. Coordinates pointed to a German machine gun nest pinning down the leftmost Allied rifle platoon. That platoon could not advance and could not withdraw. Mortar support was the only option. Einar gave the command. The assistant gunner placed the round. The tube fired. The shield trembled under fresh incoming fragments. Dirt fell from the upper layer. The spotting correction arrived. Adjust 3 degrees left. Increase elevation. Fire for effect. Einar directed the crew. More rounds left the tube. The German counter battery. Response intensified. One shell landed close enough to knock 2 men from their stance. They staggered but remained unharmed. The shield absorbed most of the blast energy. They resumed firing. At 1007 hours, a large explosion shook the pit. A shell struck the ground less than 20 meters away. The shockwave hammered the shield. The top row collapsed partially inward. Soil spilled across the pit floor. Loose bags tumbled forward. The assistant gunner instinctively ducked. A burst of fragments struck the shield and embedded across the outer layer. The crew crouched low. The structure held, though barely. Einar assessed the damage. They needed to reinforce immediately. 2 men lifted a spare module and positioned it against the weakened front row. Soil compacted around the base. The new row stabilized the structure. The crew resumed the mission. Their breaths came in rapid bursts. Sweat mixed with dust across their faces. Yet they continued. By 1012 hours, rifle units reported that the machine gun nest had been silenced. Mortar fire had landed directly behind the German position. The enemy fell back several meters. The trapped platoon could move again. The mission succeeded. But the counter-fire did not stop. German artillery continued to hammer the area. Shells struck in rapid sequence. The blasts forced 2 neighboring mortar crews to abandon their pits and seek cover. Those crews had built their shields too late and too small. They suffered casualties. Einar's team stayed low behind their reinforced wall. Fragments peppered the barrier again. The air filled with dust and smoke. The smell of burning soil drifted across the pit. The men remained steady. They had learned how to trust the structure. They had learned how to repair it under pressure. They had learned how to survive. At 1018 hours, a platoon leader from the nearby rifle company approached under cover of the shield. He crouched beside Einar and relayed urgent news. German forces were massing for a deeper push toward the center of the line. They needed sustained mortar fire to break the buildup before it grew into a coordinated thrust. This mission required volume and speed. The danger level rose again. Einar nodded. He understood the stakes. He ordered the crew to adjust the pit and clear the workspace. They stabilized the right flank of the shield and added a supporting row of bags. They checked ammunition crates. They confirmed tube alignment. By 10:23 hours they stood ready for the next barrage. The order arrived. Fire mission. High volume. Continuous adjustment. Einar called the first range. The assistant gunner dropped the round. The tube barked. The shield trembled. Incoming fragments sliced across the canvas. The crew moved with mechanical precision. They fired, adjusted, fired again. The sound of the mortar blended with the thunder of incoming shells. At 1028 hours, a near-direct hit struck only 15 meters away. The explosion threw debris into the pit. A stone fragment struck Einar's helmet and knocked him sideways. He steadied himself and resumed command. The crew replaced another torn top row bag. Soil streamed over their boots. But they remained operational. At 1031 hours, the German buildup began to falter. Allied spotters reported disrupted formations. Several enemy units attempted to retreat to secondary positions. Mortar fire continued. Rifle units advanced 3 meters. Then 5. Then 7. The line held firm. At 1034 hours, a new threat emerged. German machine gun teams attempted to flank the mortar pits again, this time using a shallow ditch to approach from the south. Several mortar crews scrambled to reposition. But Einar's team already had modules prepared. They lifted the clusters and extended the shield into a defensive angle facing the ditch. The barrier formed instantly. The crew crouched behind it. Incoming small arms fire struck the modules and embedded in the canvas. None penetrated fully. The crew maintained fire support. They shifted the tube slightly and launched rounds into the ditch. Explosions rocked the enemy position. The machine gun team scattered. Rifle units moved to intercept. The threat ended as quickly as it formed. By 1041 hours, the battlefield quieted. Enemy artillery reduced output. German infantry attempted only minor movements. Allied units reported stabilized lines across the sector. Mortar crews took the opportunity to repair damage. Einar's team inspected the shield. Several bags were shredded. Soil piled at the base. The modules showed deep fragment gouges. Yet the structure remained fundamentally intact. More officers arrived. They inspected the barrier again. They asked Einar questions about maintenance, repair time, and modular deployment. They wrote detailed notes. They photographed the structure for documentation. Einar answered every question with calm precision. At 1049 hours, Battalion Command sent a message. They wanted a full description of the shield's construction and performance. The message stated that casualty rates among mortar teams had dropped sharply in the last 2 hours, correlating directly with the adoption of rapid grain bag defenses. Command wanted a field report. They wanted sketches. They wanted measurements. They wanted deployment times. They wanted to study the innovation. Einar realized the importance of the moment. Mortar crews were often the first targeted and the least protected. Their survival shaped the success of infantry maneuvers. His shield had proven itself in the most brutal conditions. It changed the tempo of battle. It gave crews seconds they never had before. It allowed them to fire more rounds and save more men. He sat beside the shield and looked across the valley. Smoke drifted between ruined farmhouses. The sound of distant gunfire echoed faintly. The morning had been violent and costly. Yet his crew stood alive. They had fought through repeated barrages. They had held the line. They had demonstrated that simple innovation could alter outcomes in a brutal landscape. By late morning the tempo of the battlefield slowed. The German artillery fire diminished, replaced by scattered small arms exchanges and the steady crack of distant rifles. The worst of the counter-battery duels had passed. Mortar crews across the sector repaired their improvised shields. Some rebuilt entire sections. Others expanded their walls into full semicircular emplacements. The line now looked different from how it had started that morning. Where there had once been open pits and exposed crews, there were now layered barriers of grain bags, soil packed tight, modules arranged with purpose. At 1106 hours a field courier delivered the formal request from battalion headquarters. They needed a complete account of the shield. They wanted construction steps, recommended bag count, ideal soil type, and arrangement for rapid deployment. Einar dictated the instructions with careful clarity. The courier wrote it all down. The report would move up the chain, informing other sectors and possibly reaching division engineers. As Einar finished the description, the courier paused and asked how he had thought of the idea. Einar explained the simple truth. He learned it on the farm. Years of building temporary grain walls and windbreaks taught him how to work with weight, soil, and fabric. His memory of storms tearing across open fields guided his instinct. He said it felt natural to build with what he understood. The courier nodded and headed back toward headquarters. The crew took a brief moment to rest. They sat behind the shield, drinking water, rubbing their hands and stretching their cramped legs. The exhaustion in their eyes showed the toll of the morning. Yet they were alive. They knew why. The barrier had taken impacts that would have killed them. The bags bore the scars of every barrage. Torn canvas. Embedded fragments. Compressed soil. Each mark represented an exchange survived. At 1121 hours an officer from Division Intelligence stopped at the pit. He walked around the shield inspecting the angles and layers. He remarked that the design reminded him of early war field fortifications improvised by British units during the retreat from Crete. Yet this version was faster, lighter, and adapted to the soil of central Italy. He said doctrine often lagged behind battlefield reality. Field innovation filled the gap. He thanked Einar and left. The final fire mission of the late morning arrived at 1129 hours. It was brief. A small German reconnaissance group attempted to test the Allied line. The mortar crews responded immediately. Rounds landed with precision. The probe ended in minutes. When the echoes faded, the line held steady. Engineers began mapping improved positions. Officers prepared after-action assessments. Einar looked at the shield one last time before noon. It stood as proof of what simple ideas could achieve under pressure. It had saved a mortar crew in minutes. Then it saved others. Then it reshaped defensive practice across the sector. It showed that innovation did not always come from factories or laboratories. Sometimes it came from a farmer who understood soil, fabric, and the urgency of survival. His name would not appear in most reports. The shield would be discussed as a useful field expedient. But the men who lived because of it would remember. They would know that a tenant farmer from Minnesota changed their odds in a brutal campaign.